They were trained from birth to kill. Entire civilizations built around the art of war. These are history's most fearsome warrior cultures, where being soft meant death and weakness was bred out like a disease. The Spartans. You've heard the legends, seen the movies. But the reality was far more brutal than Hollywood could ever show. It's 480 BC, and a newborn baby is carried by his father to a group of elderly men sitting in judgment. They inspect the infant, checking for deformities, weakness, any sign of imperfection. The father waits, knowing what comes next. If the baby passes, he lives. If not, he's carried to a cliff called the Apothetai and thrown off. This isn't cruelty, this is Sparta. The boys who survived that first test faced something far worse. At age 7, they were ripped from their mothers and thrown into the Agoge. The most brutal military training program in human history. Imagine being 7 years old, taken from everything you know, and told you're now property of the state. You sleep outside in the cold with no blanket, forced to make your own bed from reeds you gathered by hand. You're given barely enough food to survive, not because they're poor, but because they want you to steal. Getting caught means a severe beating, not for stealing, but for being stupid enough to get caught. The boys formed packs, hunting and fighting each other for scraps. They were encouraged to battle amongst themselves, creating a hierarchy of violence. The weak were brutalized until they became strong or died trying. At age 12, the training intensified. They were given one cloak for the entire year. Forced to march barefoot regardless of terrain, and beaten randomly to build pain tolerance. The instructors called it hardening. The boys called it survival. But here's what most people miss about Spartan training. It wasn't just physical. These boys were taught to read and write, to appreciate music and poetry, to engage in philosophical debate. Why? Because Sparta understood something. Modern militaries are only now rediscovering. The deadliest weapon isn't the strongest body. It's the sharpest mind combined with absolute ruthlessness. At age 20, after 13 years of this hell, came the final test. Each young man had to kill a helot, one of Sparta's enslaved population, without being detected. This wasn't just murder, this was a calculated hunt. Plan the approach, execute the kill, disappear without a trace. Pass this test and you became a full Spartan citizen. Fail and you were cast out, forbidden from even living in Sparta. Now you might be thinking this created psychopaths, and you'd be partially right. But it also created the most disciplined fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. When 300 Spartans stood at Thermopylae against hundreds of thousands of Persian invaders, they weren't being brave. They were doing exactly what they'd been programmed to do since birth. Hold the line or die. There was no other option in their minds. The results speak for themselves. For over 2 centuries, Sparta remained undefeated in pitched battle, not because they had better weapons or superior numbers, but because every single man was a weapon forged over decades of suffering. But the Spartans had a fatal flaw built into their system. Their population was tiny compared to other Greek city-states because so many babies failed that initial inspection. So many boys died in training. So many young men fell in battle. They were breeding themselves into extinction, creating warriors so perfect that eventually there weren't enough of them left to matter. Halfway across the world, another warrior culture was solving this problem differently. The Mongols didn't selectively breed their fighters, they made everyone a fighter. Men, women, even children were trained to ride and shoot from the saddle. But calling them just horse archers misses the point entirely. These people were born on horseback, literally. Mongol women often gave birth while traveling, and infants were strapped to saddles before they could walk. By age 3, Mongol children were riding. By 5, they were hunting small game with tiny bows. By 10, they were expected to hit a moving target at full gallop. This wasn't a military training program, this was their everyday life. The Mongols didn't train warriors, they simply lived as warriors every single day. Their diet was whatever they could hunt or pillage. They drank fermented mare's milk that would make most people violently ill. They could survive for days on nothing but blood drained from their horses, cutting a small vein and drinking just enough to stay alive without killing their mount. Comfort was a foreign concept. Luxury was weakness. When Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes in 1206, he inherited millions of these hardened riders. But he did something brilliant that separated the Mongols from every other nomadic horde in history. He organized them with an efficiency that would make modern armies jealous. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each with clear command structures. Promotions based purely on merit, not bloodline. Desertion meant death for you and your entire unit, instant motivation for everyone to keep fighting. The Mongol military machine had one simple strategy: overwhelming speed and absolutely no mercy. They could cover 100 miles in a single day, appearing at city gates before defenders even knew an army was coming. They'd offer terms: surrender everything and live as subjects, or resist and be annihilated. Most cities surrendered. The ones that didn't became object lessons. The Mongols would slaughter every living thing, stack skulls in pyramids outside the ruins, and move on. This wasn't mindless savagery. This was psychological warfare at its finest. But what made the Mongols truly unstoppable wasn't their riding skills or their brutality. It was their ability to adapt and learn from everyone they conquered. They absorbed Chinese siege technology, Persian administrative systems, and European metallurgy. Each conquest made them stronger, smarter, deadlier. Within a single generation, the Mongols conquered more territory than the Romans did in 4 centuries. They built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary. And they did it with a military force that never exceeded 200,000 active soldiers at any one time. The secret wasn't numbers. It was the fact that every single one of those soldiers had been preparing for war since they took their first breath. The Spartans and Mongols represent opposite poles of military philosophy. But there's a third approach that makes both of them look almost quaint by comparison. Welcome to feudal Japan, where an entire social class was engineered from birth to perfect the art of killing. The samurai weren't just warriors. They were a hereditary caste that existed for one purpose: maintaining absolute military superiority over everyone else. If you were born samurai, you would die samurai. There was no other option. From the moment a samurai boy could walk, his training began. Not when he felt like it, not when he showed interest. Immediately. By age 5, he was practicing with a wooden sword. By 7, he was studying strategy and philosophy. By 13, he was expected to kill without hesitation. But here's what separates the samurai from every other warrior culture. They weaponized shame itself. The concept of Bushido, the way of the warrior, wasn't just a moral code. It was a psychological prison that made death preferable to dishonor. Lose your sword. Seppuku. Fail your lord. Seppuku. Survive a battle where your commander died. Believe it or not, seppuku. This created warriors who literally feared shame more than death. Which is exactly the kind of insane psychological conditioning that makes for terrifyingly effective soldiers. And they had the weapons to back it up. The katana wasn't just a sword. It was a masterpiece of metallurgy that took Japanese swordsmiths centuries to perfect. They folded the steel thousands of times, creating a blade that could slice through bone like butter, while remaining flexible enough not to shatter. A master swordsman could draw and cut a man in half in a single motion faster than most people could blink. They called it Iajutsu, and it turned the simple act of unsheathing a sword into a lethal art form. The samurai also pioneered something that would change warfare forever. They figured out how to make guns actually matter in battle. When Portuguese traders introduced firearms to Japan in 1543, most military cultures dismissed them as loud, inaccurate toys. The samurai saw potential. Within 50 years, Japan had more guns than any European nation. They organized entire regiments of ashigaru, foot soldiers armed with matchlock rifles, and used them to devastating effect. The Battle of Nagashino in 1575 proved just how deadly this combination could be. Takeda Katsuyori led 15,000 of the finest cavalry in Japan against Oda Nobunaga's forces. Takeda's horsemen were legendary, samurai who trained their entire lives for mounted combat. They should have crushed Nobunaga's army. Instead, they rode directly into 3,000 matchlock rifles firing in rotating volleys. The Takeda cavalry was slaughtered. 70% casualties in a single afternoon. Nobunaga didn't just win, he obsoleted an entire way of warfare. This adaptability is what kept the samurai relevant for 7 centuries. They started as mounted archers, became master swordsmen, then incorporated firearms without losing any of their previous skills. A single samurai warrior in 1600 could shoot you with a bow from horseback, gun you down with a matchlock, or cut you apart with a katana, whatever the situation required. But all this military perfection came with a cost that eventually destroyed them. The samurai became so obsessed with honor and tradition that they couldn't adapt when the world changed around them. When Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in 1853 with modern weapons, and demands to open Japan to trade, the samurai realized their swords and matchlocks were medieval compared to Western technology. Some tried to modernize. Others doubled down on tradition. The empire split. The Boshin War of 1868 became a clash between old and new Japan. Traditional samurai in full armor charged against their own countrymen armed with modern rifles and artillery. It was a bloodbath. The modernizers won, and the samurai class was officially abolished in 1876. Within a single generation, a warrior culture that had dominated Japan for 700 years simply ceased to exist. Except it didn't, not really. The samurai might have lost their legal status, but their influence shaped everything that came after. Japanese military culture in World War II was basically Bushido with machine guns. The same obsession with honor, the same preference for death over surrender, the same willingness to die for the emperor. Kamikaze pilots were samurai in planes. Banzai charges were samurai tactics with rifles. So what do these three warrior cultures actually teach us? The Spartans show what happens when you optimize everything for a single purpose. You create something perfect and completely unsustainable. The Mongols prove that adaptability and speed can overcome almost any advantage in numbers or technology. The samurai demonstrate how cultural conditioning can create warriors who literally cannot conceive of retreat or surrender. But there's a pattern here that's darker than any of them probably intended. Every single one of these cultures eventually destroyed themselves through their own success. The Spartans bred themselves into irrelevance. The Mongol Empire fractured the moment Genghis Khan's descendants started fighting each other. The samurai became so rigid that modernization meant extinction. The uncomfortable truth is that cultures built entirely around war tend to have a fatal flaw. They're incredibly good at fighting, but they have no idea what to do with peace. The Spartans had no art, no philosophy, no culture beyond battle. The Mongols built the largest empire in history and then watched it collapse within a century. Because they knew how to conquer but not how to govern. The samurai created a social order so obsessed with hierarchy and honor that it couldn't survive contact with the modern world. Which brings us to the question nobody wants to ask. What happens when you create the perfect warrior culture in an age where war itself is changing faster than any culture can adapt? Because that's exactly what modern militaries tried to do in the 20th century. And the results were catastrophic in ways none of these ancient cultures could have imagined. Take World War I, European armies went in with cavalry charges and bayonets, basically medieval tactics with rifles. They thought honor and courage would carry the day, just like it had for the samurai. Instead, they got trench warfare and machine guns. Millions dead in battles that gained maybe a few hundred yards of mud. The old warrior codes didn't just fail, they became mass suicide pacts dressed up as military strategy. Or look at Vietnam. American forces had overwhelming technological superiority. Helicopter mobility the Mongols would have envied. And firepower the Spartans couldn't have dreamed of. But they were fighting an enemy that had spent centuries perfecting guerrilla warfare against superior forces. The Viet Cong understood something all three of our warrior cultures eventually forgot. The point isn't to fight honorably or look impressive. The point is to win. And that's where every single warrior culture in history makes the same mistake. They start to believe their own mythology. The Spartans thought their training made them invincible. The Mongols thought their empire would last forever. The samurai thought Bushido made them spiritually superior to everyone else. They were all wrong. Here's what actually determines who wins: logistics, intelligence, adaptability. And the willingness to do whatever it takes when the stakes are high enough. Not honor, not tradition. Not even courage, really. The Soviet Union beat Nazi Germany not because Soviet soldiers were braver or better trained, they weren't, but because the Soviets could replace casualties faster than Germany could inflict them. Brutal calculus, nothing romantic about it. Modern special forces units understand this better than any historical warrior culture ever did. Navy SEALs don't care about dying gloriously. They care about completing the mission and going home alive. They'll use drones, night vision, satellite intelligence, whatever asymmetric advantage they can get. There's no code of honor that says you have to give the enemy a fair fight. That's how you get killed for no reason. But there's something these ancient warrior cultures had that we've completely lost, and maybe we shouldn't have. They understood that warfare wasn't just about tactics and technology. It was about identity. A Spartan warrior knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. A Mongol horseman belonged to something larger than himself. A samurai had a code that gave meaning to violence that would otherwise be senseless. Strip that away, and what do you have? Modern soldiers coming home with PTSD because they can't reconcile what they did with who they thought they were. Ancient warriors had the same trauma, don't kid yourself, but their cultures gave them a framework to process it. We tell soldiers to do terrible things, then expect them to flip a switch and become normal civilians again. That's not how human psychology works. The warrior cultures we've looked at were monstrous in a lot of ways. The Spartans threw disabled babies off cliffs. The Mongols committed genocides that killed millions. The samurai's honor code led to suicides over trivial insults. We're right to move past all that. But we threw out something important with the brutality. Maybe the real lesson isn't that we need to copy any of these cultures. It's that we need to understand what they were actually optimizing for. And whether we're making the same mistakes in different forms. The Spartans optimized for individual warrior quality and got a tiny, brittle society. We optimize for technological superiority and wonder why we keep losing to insurgents with rifles. The Mongols optimized for mobility and conquest and built an empire that couldn't hold itself together. We optimize for global military presence and watch our adversaries find ways around it. The samurai optimized for loyalty and discipline and created a culture that couldn't survive modernization. We optimize for professionalism and precision and create soldiers who struggle to find meaning in what they've done. Different problems, same fundamental issue, optimizing for the wrong things or taking optimization too far. So what should we actually learn from the Spartans, Mongols, and samurai? Not their tactics, those are mostly useless now. Not their codes, those were built for different worlds. What we should learn is that creating warriors is easy. Creating warriors who can live with what they've done, who can adapt when everything changes. Who can build something after the fighting stops, that's the hard part. None of these cultures figured it out. The Spartans proved you can create the perfect warrior and still lose everything that matters. The Mongols showed that conquering the world means nothing if you can't hold it together. The samurai demonstrated that tradition and honor become chains when the world moves forward without you. 3 different approaches, 3 different failures, same underlying truth. Cultures built entirely around war always consume themselves eventually. That's not a bug. It's a feature. Societies that glorify violence above everything else don't get happy endings. They get Thermopylae, where 300 warriors die in a doomed last stand. That everyone remembers but nobody wants to repeat. They get empires that fragment into civil wars the moment the great conqueror dies. They get samurai charging machine guns because surrender is unthinkable. The most dangerous warrior isn't the one who's unafraid of death. It's the one who understands exactly what they're fighting for and knows when to stop fighting. None of these warrior cultures understood that. Maybe we finally do. Maybe that's the most important thing these warrior cultures can teach us. Not how to fight better, but how to recognize when an entire way of life has become its own worst enemy. The Spartans, Mongols, and samurai all created systems that worked brilliantly until suddenly they didn't. They optimized themselves into corners they couldn't escape from. We like to think we're smarter than that now, that our technology and understanding make us immune to their mistakes. But every generation thinks that, right up until they're proven catastrophically wrong.